you?
Penny, good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Good, how are you, Nona?
Even though they were all.
Of course.
When I was-
Where y'all going?
I don't know.
So when I was.
Oh, today. I'm always getting for lunch. No, she said she's still not well. I usually go pick her up and I asked her, she didn't let me know she wasn't coming, so I texted her this morning.
Yeah.
And she said she's still not doing real well.
Think of it that way. Good character.
Veronica, I like your
Thank
your Easter
Most people that.
Don't, yeah, don't
colors.
know.
Thank
They
you.
are.
Spring colors. She looks spring.
Today. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Good morning, everybody. We are live, just so you're aware.
Just one, you know, never
Um,
parents don't have any kids.
I think everybody's pretty cheerful this morning because of the weather.
Yes.
I know I am.
Yes.
Yeah,
Me
to be able to
too.
walk over and be comfortable. Yeah, it's very nice this
Took
morning.
her jackets off.
Very nice.
I didn't put mine on in here because I
What's
know.
going on?
Mary needs
Yeah,
hers.
I stink out on
That's
that
what
patio.
I bet you
and
heard.
I'm a great grandson and one
How nice.
granddaughter.
I still think it's below zero outside.
It isn't here.
Okie doke. Last week, we did talk about David in the valley of Elah, his battle or confrontation with Goliath. Today, we are going to talk about all of these chapters. This was the homework to read it. It looks like a lot, but really isn't a whole lot.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about these because we're combining a couple of topics here. David in the court, in other words, in the court of the king, and then David in friendship. And if you read that, you know it's David in friendship with Jonathan.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about those two things today. First, though, David in the court. We know that David's been anointed. We know really that his kingship has been validated through his victory over Goliath. That was huge. Saul's kingship was also validated in the same way with a victory over Philistines. No. Ammonites,
Yeah.
I think it was. Anyway, and so then David's kingship is validated here through his victory over this giant. We know from all of that, Israel did go ahead and plunder the spoil. Everything is well, as far as we know, in Saul's kingdom. It's a happy time following this victory. And as expected, David is taken into the king's court. If you remember, Samuel, when he prophesied or told Israel when they wanted a king, and he told Israel the nature of this king, what this king was going to do, over and over the phrase is, he will take, he will take, he will take, he will take. And so, it's no surprise, Saul takes David into his court. And so, let's see, what do I have here? When David is in the court of the king, he wears many hats, actually. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different aspects that I drew out of these texts. So first we're going to look at his military career. So primarily he was in his court as military personnel, I guess you would say. We know in chapter 16, verse 21, that he became Saul's armor bearer. So we know he was that, at least. But then by the time we get to chapter 18, especially verse 5, David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So he had some sort of administrative duty, I guess you could say. He went out wherever Saul sent him. He behaved wisely. What's the ESV say? I think it's different. Verse 18:5. He behaved wisely.
And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent
Successful.
him. Let's see.
Yeah, he prospered. It was everywhere he went, he had success. Let's see, and then Saul set him over the men of war. So he had some kind of administrative duty. By the time we get to verse 13 here in this chapter, we see that he really is in active duty, I guess you could say. it says in verse 13, this is chapter 18 and verse 13. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And again, verse 14, he behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. So now he has a very, very active presence in Saul's military. Hello, Linda. Welcome back. We're glad you're here today. We are just in 1 Samuel chapter 18. It says here, I think it says here, right? Where is it? Oh, verse 16. All Israel and Judah loved David. But of course we know Saul was afraid of him, right? Okay. After all, it was because, well, the women were singing, weren't they? They were singing a song, and I think that they were probably intending to bolster both Saul and David. And it does. The song does. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000. But to Saul, that was an offense. And so he didn't like that. He became very angry in verse 8. And he began to eye David from that day forward, the Bible says there. So he didn't like that. But we already know David's heart's turning because, well, the kingdom has been taken away from him. And, well, the Holy Spirit. Saul. Did I say David? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Saul.
We knew what you meant.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Saul was greatly angry, very displeased, and jealous. That's verse 8. He eyed David. We already talked about that. So that was, as you know, as you can guess, imagine, after the confrontation with Goliath in chapter 17, David has begun his military career. And he's active in Saul's army as a leader, a commander. And the Lord is with him, so he has success wherever he goes. And which is good for Saul, the king. But Saul, the king, doesn't see it. He takes it very personal. Anyway, okay, so we see his military career in the court of the king. Next, we see, if you read through these passages, we see his career as a very skilled musician, right? Does yours say harp or lyre? Lyre, yeah. A stringed instrument. I don't remember how many strings it has. Differs from the harp a little bit, but anyway. He was very skilled in playing that. We know what happened here. This is in chapter 16 when we first learn of this. In chapter 16, this is when the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul. The Spirit of the Lord comes on David. And this distressing or evil spirit was troubling Saul, and somebody in his court said, we need to find you somebody who plays beautiful music so that your soul will be soothed, basically, and you'll have comfort. And then somebody else said, I know just the man. There is, and that's in verse 18. One of the servants answered and said, so this is chapter 16, verse 18. One of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. So Saul says, all right, bring him in. And so then David comes and plays music before Saul. And I need to point out verse 21. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. That's interesting. We'll talk about that. So David is all of these things in verse 18. And at this time, Saul loves him. And verses 22 and 23 kind of close it up here. Then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. So it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. So, he was a musician. All right. I didn't have this here, but I know we already know it. But because of this passage right here in 2 Samuel 1, we know that he also wrote music. Not only did he play music, but he also wrote music. But we already knew that, of course, already, but you could add that for sure. But then we know, of course, because of the music of the women who were singing that song, Saul begins to not love David so much anymore and begins to eye him, or at least he is pretty bent on killing him. We know that. He's pretty bent on practicing some kind of ill will toward David. And so in chapter 18 is when we first read about Saul attempting himself to kill David with his spear, while David is playing his beautiful music that's supposed to soothe the king. But instead, because of who's playing the music, not the music itself, but because of who is playing the music, Saul can't get over that. And so we know in chapter 18, like verse 10, for instance, it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Then at verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Okay. I'm not entirely sure when it says here that David escaped his presence twice. I don't know if it was twice right here, like within this context, or if it's this one and the one in chapter 19 that's included together in this twice. So it's either twice here and the chapter 19 occasion, that would be 3. It's neither here nor there, that's for sure.
Right.
Or it's this one and that one in chapter 19, and that would be twice. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. But it happens again, so if you turn over to chapter 19, we'll see it again. Verse 9, chapter 19, verse 9. Now the distressing spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. I wonder if David was a little bit deja vu-ish. Okay, I've seen this happen. I've been here before. Maybe he was on his guard. He still came in and played. Obviously, it says David was playing music with his hand. Verse 10, then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. Okay. So we have David the musician. It was a good idea, but it's not going very well for him. David wants him dead and doesn't mind killing him himself, and I guess the king can just do whatever he wants to do, right? So nobody does anything that we know of. David's just on his own, pretty much. Well, then we get to the rest of chapter 18. So David's in the military, David's a musician, and now David becomes son-in-law to the king. He is now a son-in-law in the king's court. Verse 17 tells us that Saul had originally wanted to give his oldest daughter Merab to him as a wife. But then, for some reason, somehow, she, in verse 19, was given to somebody else. Adriel. But you know that Saul has an ulterior motive for this, right? Which is interesting because do you remember when in chapter 17 when David came in to check on his brothers and the situation with the Philistines there, that he saw the giant and the men were telling him this is what the king will do for the man who fights and defeats this giant. And it was, tax free stuff, favor, the father's house would have favor, and then there would be gifts and a wife and all of that. Well, did anybody ever wonder if, like, I don't see where David ever got any of that. Anybody? Maybe his father's house, became tax exempt. I don't know, but David never. So far, we don't have any record of him gaining anything, having been given any gifts or wealth or money or stuff. We know he took Goliath's head. He took his sword, but that's kind of it, I think. And we know up to this point he doesn't have a wife. He wasn't given a wife yet. So there really was no reward, right, for David's victory, like the king had said, which is interesting. Something to think about. But now Saul wants to give him a wife, not as a reward for his victory over Goliath, but so that he can have a better opportunity to kill him, right? And I think this first daughter, doesn't it say so that she would be a snare to him somewhere? So I don't guess she was a very good person. Yeah, this is verse 21. I will give her to him that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Okay, well, maybe that was said about Michael. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was said about Michael. I'm sorry. So Merab was just the oldest daughter, and he was going to give her, but then he gave her to somebody else. And then Michael, though, comes along and says, oh, but I love David. Let me have him as a husband, right? And so Saul thinks about it and says, well, okay, because I guess Michael was, I don't know, whatever it takes to be a snare. When your dad thinks that you'll be a snare to your husband. What does the ESV say? I have a little footnote here. I can't remember what it says.
Trap.
Be a bait, be bait. This would be verse 21. Yeah, a trap. Yeah,
Mine's just
bait.
I-
So Saul was going to use her to try and trap David and
Yeah, I don't know what it means. That it says that, so the hands of the Philistines will be against him. So I don't know
Well-
what the marriage has to do with the Philistines.
Well, I
but-
think it's because David, and we'll talk about this here in just a second, but David's attitude about being the son-in-law of the king, I guess we can talk about it now. He was like, I'm not even worthy to do, who am I? Who am I, and of what family do I come from that I'm going to be son-in-law to the king? I mean, that was a big position. Usually royalty was son-in-law to the king. But this was just David, a shepherd boy, being, called to be son-in-law to the king. And so he says, I don't have anything. I come to you, I don't have anything. Where is it?
18.
Verse 18? Yeah, that's where he says that. But then later he says, I don't have, he says verse 23, I am a poor and lightly esteemed man. He says, does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man? So he didn't have anything. He had no dowry, bride price to pay, especially for a king's daughter. He didn't have anything. But Saul, I think the trap he's wanting to he's got this all planned out, see, is, well, okay, all I'll require of you is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Thinking, I'm going to send him out in battle to get these, and then he'll just die there and I don't have to worry about him. So, I think that was the trap. That was Michael the bait in order to get David out there on the battlefield. But he was more than successful when he went to get that bride price. He got 200 instead of 100, and we talked about this. I think we mentioned it. That's pretty romantic.
I was thinking of it when I said, why foreskins? What is that? And it took me in mind of the circumcision. So I think maybe, that may be symbolic in some way.
Or maybe
Symbolic of
just
what?
gets him way
Just
close
of
up
the men,
to
well,
them.
of
More
the
like
men
a-
having to be circumcised to be in the Jewish faith.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he has to take them from the Philistines. So
Yeah, it's just
it's some way symbolic that's the manly thing.
Took their manliness away, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know about the word symbolic, but I do think it has to do, of course, with the fact that they were all circumcised
Yeah,
and these were uncircumcised. I mean,
Right.
you know
To prove.
the strife between the two because, you know, they were God's people by virtue of the circumcision, partly.
Well, I think he would likely be killed much easier. A man would probably fight harder for his foreskin.
Yeah.
And it would
You'd
just be a
think.
really easy way to get him killed off.
I just
maybe.
don't wanna be the soldier that has to go and get him.
No.
Right.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
when you think about the logistics, I'm not sure that's very comfortable to think about or pleasant, but this
Quite a
is
visual.
war,
Yeah.
I guess you could say. This is ancient Bible times.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
way different than we
Yeah.
fight our wars
Well, it's easier
today.
to take that than ahead.
Maybe it's a matter of
You know,
pride.
I don't know. Well, it's.
I don't know.
That the Philistines are proud of their foreskin, and so therefore, because they look at the
Possibly.
Jews, they don't have that.
Mhm.
So in taking that away from them, it's a matter of taking their pride away,
So
maybe?
ridiculous.
So I'm guessing he
anyways.
didn't do this alone because otherwise
No,
they would fight him off. I'm like, you can never accomplish that without gloves.
I don't know. It doesn't
He
say.
killed all of them and then he went and retrieved it.
It just says in verse 27, David arose and went.
Yeah.
Oh, he and his men. There it
Among
says.
those men.
Killed
Killed 200. I don't know how many men he had with him.
That's right.
Well, he was commander over, was it 1,000?
Thousands.
Maybe he took 1,000 men with him. Probably didn't need that many though. Maybe. I don't know.
He could have. And God was with him.
I have an idea about this foreskin situation, but I don't know that I can explain it very well because I didn't like spend a whole lot of time on it either. I just, in my mind, let's see, how do I explain it? I know there's this perfect word for it, but I can't think of it what it is. But it has to do with circumcision was the sign of the covenant, was a very special sign for the Jewish people. Nobody else did that in the whole on the whole planet. Nobody else did that. And so to do that to somebody, there was such a distinction between the Gentile nations and the Jewish nation that then to go and forcefully impose that on that would show an assured victory. You know, and that's what I'm trying to say. And
And
there's a
that's
word for that,
who
but I
did
don't know
it.
what it is. What?
That's who did it. I mean,
Yes. It was a sign
a sign
of
that this is who we are.
yes,
We got
yes, something
Or
like
could've
that.
been
So that's what I
Saul.
have in my mind, and that's the best I can do this morning with that.
Maybe
But
it was,
anyway.
maybe it was Saul having David do that, so maybe God wouldn't like it. Maybe he was doing that to, isn't Saul the one that?
The only reason I say I don't think so is because the text doesn't say anything about that.
But you know,
And-
knowing Saul
And
and
it's
how
quite the
evil he
opposite
was.
of that. God, this was a major victory for David.
Yeah.
God was with him.
Mhm.
And this was not only successful with 100, but with 200. So it was like God even had an extra stamp of approval on this situation.
But maybe Saul was
Maybe.
thinking it
Yeah, I
wouldn't
see where,
Maybe.
because
Maybe
Saul's the
Saul
one who told
wasn't-
him to go get him, so
Yeah.
maybe Saul
That's what I
thought,
was
there's
thinking.
no way he's gonna be able to do that to them.
Yeah,
Oh,
So
maybe
it was
Saul
kinda like
thought it would
extra
be-
insurance that
That
David's not gonna make it back.
Maybe
Right.
Saul thought it would be a disgraceful thing.
yeah,
for
or
David to
God
go
wouldn't
do.
approve of it, and
Yeah.
David doing it,
Oh,
it would
maybe
make
so.
God mad at
Yeah.
him instead of
Maybe
being
so.
on
Maybe.
his side.
We have
That's a good
no
thought.
Yeah.
text telling us that at all.
Yeah.
Other than Saul just wanted to have David killed by the Philistines.
Right.
Well, for me, it all goes back to the whole thing that I don't understand, the whole thing about foreskin and God's covenant in the first place. I don't get the connection of why. I'm not trying to question God, but it's just one of those
Why did he choose
conundrums
that?
why
That would take true devotion.
yeah. There you
Well,
go.
it's a
The-
health
There you go,
thing too.
I think that
Health
the
issue.
New Testament sheds a lot of light on
Healthier.
it, more than the Old Testament does.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Because the New Testament likens the circumcision of the flesh in the Old Testament was a shadow. of a spiritual reality, of a circumcision of the heart,
Mhm.
a cutting away of the filth of the flesh of the heart
Right.
under the new. Paul talks about that a lot. So I think that's where you may not see the full get it all in the old, but once you read the new, it sheds light on the old, and then you go, oh, okay, that's why God did that. Anyway, so maybe that helps. But anyway, we don't
just
have
had a
to.
whole class on foreskin. Thank you, Veronica.
Okay, so Merab was offered first, then Michael. David is still, his whole attitude during this whole time is, who am I to be the king's son-in-law? And so it takes some persuasion or some convincing. Saul has to send his men a couple of times to go say, hey, no, but please try to persuade him to, accept this woman for his wife. Let's see, we already read that, verse 23. That's the main one, kind of the main idea. Does it seem to you a light thing? So he didn't view himself as anything special. I think this is a pretty important verse in the sense that we get a good look into David's heart here, and his own, at least as far as his own personal assessment. He doesn't view himself as anybody
Very
in
humble.
particular. Yeah, there's a lot of humility here. Anyway, and he's doesn't have anything, and he still views himself as lightly esteemed, even though the women are singing this song about him killing even more than the king, So, but he doesn't. He's not very. He doesn't take a lot of pride in that, I don't guess. In that sense, it's not. He still maintains his humility here. So his attitude is very different than that of Saul's. I think early on, Saul's attitude was a little bit like this. I think there's a phrase somewhere where you're reading through there about Saul saw himself as, Samuel said to Saul, when you once saw yourself little in your own eyes, something like that. Samuel said that to Saul. So he at one time had this attitude of humility and who am I and that kind of thing. But he lost that eventually. Anyway, but David seems to have a really humble attitude about the whole thing. But he does go ahead and marry Michael, right? And so he becomes the king's son-in-law in the king's court. And then pretty soon, this is the last one I have here, he becomes a fugitive of the king's court. So in Michael, he has a wife, but in Michael, he also has an ally. This is chapter 19. This is either the second or the third time when David is before Saul playing music, and Saul tries to kill him with his spear, and it says in verse 10, this is chapter 19, verse 10, right at the end there, so David fled and escaped that night. Verse 11, Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he's sick. Then Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him anyway. Bring him up in his bed, that I may kill him. So when the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. Saul then said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul and said, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Okay. So David flees, primarily with the help of his wife. She loves him, remember. She doesn't want him to die by the hand of her father. And so she lets him out of this window and then buys some time by setting up this decoy in the house. And then, you know, continues on with the ruse of he's sick. That buys a little bit more time. But then Saul wants him anyway. And so they come back to get him and they figure this all out. And then pretty soon she realizes, I'm sure, well, I need to cover my tracks. And so she continues the ruse and says, well, David said he was going to kill me. Well, I don't think that's true at all here, because there's no indication that that was true at all. But she says it so that her father won't kill her, right? Because she already knows her father was willing to kill Jonathan already, and David. He has no sense, at least, and so who is she? She could be next, no doubt. But anyway, it works. And so Saul doesn't kill Michal here. Let me see, what do I have here? Got ahead of my notes. No, I think that's all right. I guess all we can say about Michal here is that, so David leaves, and so from here on out, well, after chapter 20, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but as far as David and Michal go, you know, David flees, and he's on the run for the rest of the book. And so now you have Michal without her husband. He's on the run and I don't know the timeline, I don't know how many months, years, I'm not sure how long. Well, then we know from chapter 25 that Saul gives Michal to somebody else as a wife. Because David's not there, right? And of course Saul's hoping that David's going to either die by his own devices in the wilderness, or that Saul's actually going to catch him and kill him. But we also learn that in 2 Samuel 3, once Saul is dead, David gets her back, goes and takes what's rightfully his, and so then she is his wife once again. That's 2 Samuel 3. So in 1 Samuel 25, Saul gives her away to somebody else. And then in 2 Samuel 3, David takes her back. And it's in 2 Samuel 6 we learn that she's barren. So they don't have any kids. In case you didn't know that. But anyway. But for the time, as far as we know right here, early on at least in their marriage, she is an ally to David. She loves him. And so she helps him and really risks her own life for him. But she was willing to do that. I think she went to great lengths to save him, actually. That was some clever thinking on her part to do what she did. Anyway, so David has an ally in Michal. So now David is on the run. He's a fugitive through no fault of his own, but he has a friend. And so that brings us to David now in friendship. David in friendship with Jonathan. We first learn of Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 13. That's where we are first introduced to Jonathan.
What was that?
1 Samuel 13. And we also know from 1 Chronicles 8 and 9 that Jonathan, more than likely, at least when he's listed there in the genealogy, Jonathan would be Saul's firstborn. So he's heir apparent, he's the prince to the throne. He's, if Saul's dynasty would have continued, would have been the next king. We also learn that he is commander over 1,000 men in Saul's army. And he successfully attacks Philistines a couple of different times. He's doing the very thing that his father, the king, was anointed to do, but that his father the king wasn't doing. Does that make sense? Early on, when Saul became king, he had some a victory, I guess, as far as what we know is recorded. But then pretty soon, when you get to chapter 14, by the time you get to 14, Jonathan is the one going out, fighting the Philistines. And we see Saul sitting under a pomegranate tree, under the shade, not doing what a king is supposed to do. But instead, his son Jonathan is doing that, and he's having success. God is granting him success. And then we know that Jonathan eats the honey. Remember that?
Mhm.
Because Saul made this really hasty oath that he made everybody take to not eat any food in the midst of this battle. And so Jonathan didn't know anything about it, and so he refreshes himself and eats some honey, and then it comes, Saul becomes aware of this, and then what does Saul want to do to Jonathan?
Kill him.
Kill him. But thankfully, he's spared by other men in the camp who are of reason, and they talk Saul out of it. But of course, we know Saul's foolishness isn't over yet. But what's interesting, and I don't know, I will freely admit that for most of my time in the Word of God, whenever I'd read chapter 17 about David and Goliath, it was always like it was just one separate story out of the flow of anything. It was just its own singular chapter because it tells its own story within one chapter. And so I forgot, okay, well maybe the next chapter has something to do with the previous chapter. And in this case it really does. I think it speaks a lot. So when you open up to chapter 18, it's really no wonder that these first 4 verses follow the text of chapter 17. Because this is what the text says, beginning in chapter 18 and verse 1. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Then verse 2, Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Verse 3, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. Now, I don't know about you, but I think those 4 verses following the victory over Goliath speak volumes. They speak volumes about Jonathan. I think they give us a huge glimpse into the type of man Jonathan was. To say, I'm going to get ahead of myself here. To say, like in verse 1, that Jonathan loved him as his own soul. It says it again in verse 3. He loved him as his own soul. There have been, of course, people who even suggest that the original intention of the writer of this text was intending to tell us that they had a homosexual relationship. Originally, yes. And that eventually the text was corrupted and came down to us in this more heterosexual version, I guess. So that the heterosexuals weren't offended, I guess, or something. I don't know. Anyway. But really, to suggest even any type of homosexual immorality between David and Jonathan really cheapens their love for one another, doesn't it? And that's what the whole gay pride, love is love movement is all about anyway. It cheapens what love is, really. And so it does that here, people who try to promote this. The word for love in these passages, in these verses, are the same as the word that, where it says that Michael loved David, it's the same word. Saul loved David, same word. Hiram later, who provides a bunch of material for building the temple, loves David, same word. So it's not like a unique or different type of word, it's the same word. But Jonathan's love for David is deeper than just like a natural affection here, I think. I think what we glean from this, especially because these verses are right after David's victory over Goliath, is that these two men were probably made from the same kind of cloth. Does that make sense? They were both valiant, courageous, capable men in battle, in war. They loved God, or at least they trusted in God. We learn that about Jonathan when he's going to battle against Philistines in earlier chapters. So they had a lot in common. It seems that their very core, the very nature of who they were, their heart, it seems like they were in sync with one another, that they related to one another very well, that Jonathan could relate to David, and what Jonathan saw David do in the valley of Elah really spoke to Jonathan. It really touched him, and Jonathan saw more than just the victory there, but he saw into the man of David, into his heart. So when you have two people come together like that, there can't help but be a deep bond, right? You may have that with somebody right now, or maybe you had it at one time with somebody before. I don't think everybody gets to experience that, but it's a good thing when you get to.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good thing. And so what they had was very unique in a lot of ways. And not only that, but I don't know, I'm going to get ahead of myself here. What do I have? Hold on. Let's see here. Not only that, I will go ahead and say it. Not only that, Jonathan, by the time we get to verse 4, we see the position he is taking here with David. He wasn't just being nice to David by giving him these things. I do think that these are symbolic.
Absolutely.
We see in other places in the Old Testament where people took off their garments as a symbol of a transfer of authority.
Respect.
Elijah did that to Elisha. Took off his mantle and threw it on Elisha. Who else did it? I can't remember. Somebody else. Anyway, I know I have it written here somewhere. Oh, Aaron. Aaron did that when he was getting ready to die, and put his robe, his garments on Eleazar, his son, in order to show a transfer of authority in the priesthood. Okay. Even the giving of one's sword was a symbol or an act of submission. And so the position that this prince now takes in the presence of David is huge. Jonathan doesn't seem to be bothered that David, well, let me say this. I don't know. We don't know at this juncture how much Jonathan knew about David, or even how much David knew about David being the next king. But Jonathan, I don't know, he was willing, and he saw something enough in him, I guess, and knew that the Lord was with him. And maybe he put two and two together himself, and so he does this act here of taking off his robe and his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt, and giving it all to David as a relinquishment of his right to the throne. perhaps Jonathan perceived, no, this is the one who's going to reign next. We know eventually that Jonathan does know this factually, and David does know this factually. But this early on, I don't know. The text doesn't say that, but this gesture means a whole lot. So it's not just Jonathan being nice. I just have here, not sure how much Jonathan knew at this juncture that David would be the next king, but Jonathan exhibits a strong personal loyalty to David through this selfless act. It's a strong statement of love and respect. So it's no wonder that it follows chapter 17. So I will never ever from here on out take chapter 17 and just pull it out by itself. I think chapter 18, the beginning especially, speaks volumes to it. Okay, and then in verse 3, Jonathan and David made a covenant together because he loved him as his own soul. We don't have any indication as to what the covenant is here, other than it seems as if because of what we read here that it is that mutual love and respect toward one another, faithfulness to one another that they're going to strive for, mutual loyalty and friendship, and we're going to see that play out, is why I say that. We're going to see that mutual loyalty and friendship play out as we go through this friendship, these verses. Okay, but I do also want to point out, as you're reading through chapters 18, 19, and 20, one thing is for certain that the writer of this text is trying to get us to see. For certain, that everybody loves him. Saul loved him at one point, we know that. Jonathan loves him, the people love him, his army, Saul's army loves him, Michael loves him. Did I say Jonathan? Jonathan loves him. Okay, but Saul is beginning to not love him. That's what we're seeing here. And so in chapter 19, in the first few verses here, verses 1 through 7, we have here where Jonathan intercedes on behalf of his friend David. We don't really have time to read all of those verses, but it just says in verse 1 that Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and said, I want to kill David. All right. So Jonathan doesn't take that lying down, and he tries to reason with his father here and says, are you sure you really want to do that? I mean, this is what David's done for you. Are you sure that you want to kill him? And so then it says in verse 6 that Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan and swore, saying, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. So for now anyway, Saul is okay with letting David live. So it worked. Jonathan interceded on behalf of David. And it says at the end, or at verse 7, that Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. All right, so it worked for a time, but then we know what happens next. There was war again, verse 8. David went out and fought with the Philistines. He was very successful. Then verse 9, the distressing spirit came upon Saul. David then comes before Saul to play his music, and that's where we read at the end of verse 10 that Saul had to flee, and he escaped that night. Michael then lets him out the window. All of that occurred right there. And then look at verse 18. So David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him, and he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth in Ramah. Okay, so he's taking refuge now with Samuel the prophet. That's a good place to go. It's very smart to go there. This, I think, it might be the only the second time that David has ever seen Samuel. The first time is when Samuel came and anointed him. And as far as we know, this is only the second time, and the last one, I think, that they meet or are together. And then a whole situation happens there at the rest of chapter 19, but we're not interested in that for this study today. So we'll talk about that another time. But chapter 20, that's what we're interested in. We're interested in chapter 20 because a lot happens in chapter 20. We see here the covenant extended. This mutual promise of protection flourishes here in this chapter. After escaping to Ramah, David left Naioth in Ramah. This is chapter 20 and verse 1. And he went to Jonathan, his friend, and basically went to him and said, why? Why? And I see this more of just needing information, but really requesting comfort and encouragement. He goes to the only other person on the planet that he can trust. He already went to Samuel, right? He knew he could trust Samuel, but the only other person he knew that he could trust was Jonathan. And so he goes, and it's almost as if in tears maybe, and just in anguish, he says what he says in verse 1. To Jonathan, he says, what have I done? What is my iniquity and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? So he's in anguish about this because he's done nothing wrong. He knows that. But yet the king won't let up. And Jonathan immediately tries to encourage him by saying, oh, no. That's never going to happen to you. Right? That's what he says in verse 2. By no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father won't do anything either great or small without first telling me. So why would my father hide this thing from me? Because, after all, the last thing that Saul had sworn to Jonathan was that I'm not going to kill him. And Jonathan apparently hasn't heard anything more about that. But David knows, David's on the run, obviously. Okay. David explains it in verse 3 and says, well, probably because your father knows that you like me. He knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And so he said, don't let Jonathan know anything, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And so he is bearing his soul, his heart, to his friend. And Jonathan sees the seriousness of this situation. And so he says in verse 4, whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you. So he's on board. He knows, okay, this is serious. My friend has come to me. He's laid his heart before me. I can see how this would make sense and be right, that he wouldn't be lying to me about this, because my father is kind of a maniac. Anyway, he's wanted to kill him before. Okay, so he says, okay, whatever you say, let's do it. And so then beginning in verse 5, David talks to Jonathan, and David's supposed to be at this feast because of the new moon. He's supposed to sit by the king during this feast banquet or whatever. And he says, your father's going to wonder where I am, and so he says, when he does, tell him this. Did y'all read this? Because I don't think I need to go through. Okay, good. Because there's so much that happens in here. Okay, but the whole bottom line is that they promise to protect one another here. Jonathan is going to protect David immediately by providing him either the good news, you're safe in the court, or the bad news, you're not safe in the court, but I'm going to provide the opportunity for you to escape freely and not have to, be scared, at least immediately. So Jonathan is going to help protect David immediately, while David then promises to protect Jonathan eventually, later. And not even Jonathan personally, because we know that Jonathan dies, but Jonathan's descendants, his family tree. Because what do kings do generally when they come into power? They kill everybody off from the previous dynasty. And so Jonathan doesn't want that to be the fate of his son. Mephibosheth, that's the one. Wasn't he lame, right? I think he was lame.
think so.
But anyway. And so he knows that David would have that right because, the new king doesn't want somebody to come up and
Take him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mutiny.
Yeah, mutiny. Anyway, so that's what happens here essentially. Jonathan promises to protect David now. David promises to protect Jonathan later. His genealogy, his family tree, bloodline. Right? Okay. I don't know what else to say. Let's see. I get so off track on my notes here. Okay, I guess we can fast forward. So the feast happens. The king, the first day of the feast, just thinks, oh, David must be unclean, so he can't come to the feast. But then the next day, he is not happy that David's not there. And so then Jonathan, he knows, because it says here, let's see. Verse 27. And it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to eat, either yesterday or today? So Jonathan answered Saul and said, well, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. So I said, go ahead. And then verse 30. Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan. He cusses him out, basically. And then verse 31, as he goes on in verse 30, verse 31. And then verse 32. Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? So again, he tries to reason with his father. But this time, verse 33, Saul, because he likes his spear, cast his spear at Jonathan to kill him. And so then Jonathan knew for sure that Saul was determined to kill David. So Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger and ate no food. I would say that was a righteous anger right there. And he ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. So not only was there righteous anger, but there was grief, sorrow, a mourning of sorts in his heart, because he felt sorry or bad for David. And so, beginning in verse 35, he goes out into the field where David is. And I think it's kind of something to think about. David is in a place that he's used to being in, a field. You ever thought about that? It wasn't a problem for David to be out in the field. A couple of days even. That wasn't a big deal. It was, I'm sure he was comfortable there because he spent many day and night out in the field with his sheep. And so he is back in the place where he once was, the place from which he came, I guess, a field, and he's waiting for the news from Jonathan. And Jonathan comes with that little lad, shoots the arrows, and then cries out in verse 38, this was a message for David. Jonathan cried out after the lad, make haste, hurry, do not delay. Of course, those words were for David, weren't they? More so than for the lad. So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master. The lad did not know anything about what was going on. Verse 40, Jonathan gave the lad his weapons and told him to go on into the city. And then we read verses 41 and 42. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed down 3 times. And they kissed one another, and they wept together, but David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. You can imagine. There's a show coming out on Amazon.
Ask you about that.
What's it called? Life with David?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah,
Something. I don't remember
something
the title
David,
of it. At the end of this month, I think, when it's first going to air. I hope they do this scene justice. I played, you know how you do. You play it in your mind with the words that you're reading from the page, as you do with any book, really. And anyway, so I'm curious to see. But anyway, speaking of that show, I guess it's a series. I think it's going to be a series. I was talking, Melinda had told me about it last week after class, and I meant to mention it last week after class, but I forgot. And she texted me after and I was telling her, I said, I know it's coming out, and I saw the previews of it, and you know how you are with biblical things that come on TV. You gotta, okay. So I always want to know the text before I watch. So I told Melinda that I was probably gonna wait to watch it, just kind of like seeing the show in Branson, waiting to watch until after I've studied, so that I'm not persuaded one way or the other, or misled by what I'm watching in front of me. Anyway, but it may be really good. I don't have any idea. And I don't know what kind of chronology they're going to take with it. I don't know what kind of liberties they're going to take with all that. But anyway, I hope they do this scene justice.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't see the significance of this boy and the arrows.
Yeah.
If he's gonna, now, if he were just sending this message to David and David was gonna go, I get it, but yet they still had this moment together, so why didn't he just come out there and tell him, you gotta run,
He had to,
I don't,
it was
I
his
just
decoy.
didn't-
Signaling him?
He was the decoy
Yeah.
Yeah,
I hope.
for
Saul.
his dad.
Uh-huh.
And the little boy
oh,
was his,
I get it.
yeah.
I'm gonna go
So he-
shoot, Father.
Yeah.
Kind of,
Father.
right, yeah, I'm gonna,
Okay.
Saul
So he
sees
had to
him,
take the little boy.
yeah, not just
okay.
meandering out into the
Right.
field
I didn't
for no apparent reason. It
think
was
about
Yeah.
Saul knowing
a
that he went out there.
decoy, yeah.
Yeah, I think he had spies on him, cause they watched the house
Gotcha.
and everything.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, thank you, 'cause I was like, I just don't get it.
I
He's
neither.
gonna go out there and talk to him, just go out there and talk to him.
Yeah, I know, he's a good little decoy.
So I know we're already okay. So here we have there are just a few things to point out in verses 41 and 42. Number one is that David speaks no words before he falls to the ground and bows down 3 times. And from what I understand, there's nobody else in Scripture who has done this to anybody at one time. Bow down this much. So he bows down. This is, a really brilliant, silent display of humility here. Respect, even submission to Jonathan for his aid, for his help, for his friendship. And then Jonathan counters that with, a kiss. They kissed one another, and then they wept together, and David wept even more than Jonathan did, which speaks volumes, really, about both men, about David's heart and Jonathan's heart. The weight of the moment, I think, is right there, with them weeping together, but David more so. It just kind of emphasizes David's loyalty and commitment to the heir apparent, the prince. Jonathan understood what was happening here, and he tells David to go in peace. We've made this covenant between you and me, between our descendants, your descendants and mine. And so there is, I'm sure David, though this was a difficult situation, I think they both parted with peace in their souls, right? I think they both parted peacefully here. They knew they could trust one another. And so even though they do see one another one more time, This isn't the last time that they see one another. And that's in chapter 23, verses 16 through 18. So if you'll go over there real quick. David is well on the run here. He's had some difficult times. He has a little bitty army of 400 men. He just battled over in the city of Keilah. And he got word of it, that David was in Keilah. David takes off. He goes into the wilderness of Ziph. This is verses 14 and 15. And this is where Jonathan comes to see David. Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. And he says to him in verse 17, do not fear. For the hand of Saul, my father, shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father knows that. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. I think it was just along the same lines, a recommitment sort of the original covenant of mutual loyalty and protection here. And Jonathan stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own house. So this is the last time that they see one another. And here we have another beautiful scene I can imagine. David, newly on the run, and he's having to fight for his life, and he's got now an army that he has to feed and people to take care of. And even though there are only 400 men, there's still 400 men that, require things. And so he's become a leader of his own, on his own, I guess. And so no doubt he's encouraged here by seeing his friend once again. But probably David's most encouraged by Jonathan's certainty and optimism about the future. The future in God. Reminding David of the power and purpose of God, that all of this is the Lord's will, and so then David does not need to fear. Right? I think that's what we see here. But Jonathan's story isn't over yet. Very last chapter of this book, 1 Samuel chapter 31. Jonathan dies in battle with his father, which is kind of sad in and of itself, right? But, what's the word? Valiant. Because it's such heartbreaking news to David when he learns of it, that he sits down to write a song about it, to commemorate the death of Jonathan and David. And so it's called the Song of the Bow in 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is verses 17 through 27. We won't go through all of the words of this song, but it was important enough. The occasion was important enough that it required words to be written down for David. And so he does that. And not only that, but he instructs this song to be taught to God's people. And then it was written in this book. Mine says it was written in the book of Jasher. Is that what the ESV says? Jasher, the book of Jasher, literally, I guess from what I understand, do you have a footnote? Yeah. It's the scroll of the upright. What verse is this? Chapter 2 Samuel 1, chapter 18, chapter 1, verse 18.
Okay.
That means book of the upright, or book of the righteous. And so it was commemorated in that. Now we don't have that book, but that's what it was known as. And apparently it was a work that detailed the heroic exploits of Israelites. And so this song was included in that book. I hope y'all read it. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. But over and over, he says, I think 3 times, how the mighty have fallen. And he paints, I don't know, it was kind of interesting to me that David, through all of this that he had to endure with Saul, paints Saul in a pleasant light. Why? Well, probably because David knew all along this was the Lord's anointed. God chose him to be king. That's why David had 2 times the opportunity to kill him, but he didn't. And every time he said, because he's the Lord's anointed. Who am I to strike my hand against, raise my hand against this, the Lord's anointed, the one God chose. And so he paints them both, Saul and Jonathan, in a very pleasant light. And he highlights Jonathan, though, a little bit. In verse 26, primarily. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. From what I understand, this song, I even have a quote here somewhere, by scholars and people who study Hebrew poetry, like the Psalms, these songs that are the Song of Moses or Song of Miriam or whatever, people who study those things say that this right here is, quote, one of the finest specimens of Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament, by the way it's written. I don't know enough about Hebrew to know, but apparently people who study that kind of things, this stands out just by the way it was written. Not even just the words that are in there, but by the way it was written. So it stands out in that regard. It paid tribute to Israel's first royal family, right? And it dealt with the issue of grief over loved ones dying in battle, right? And then, of course, David's own personal grief over his loved ones dying in battle. It's a beautiful tribute, I guess, to his friend Jonathan. I have only one other thing to say. Well, I have 2. I'll try to go quickly. This is something that I never gave much thought to until really preparing for this class. Because every time, I don't know about you, but when you think of David and Jonathan, do you think of David and Jonathan being close in age?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So hang with me here and see what you think about this. So we know that Saul, he reigned 40 years, according to what Paul says in Acts chapter 13. Saul reigned 40 years. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. So David was not even born when Saul became king. Saul had already reigned 10 years when David was born. Right? Okay. So David began to reign when he was 30, which means that more than likely Jonathan, especially because Jonathan was Saul's oldest son, was like a father figure to David more than a buddy. Which meant that Saul could have very well been his grandfather in that scenario. So that I think is even more spectacular. To think of Jonathan and David's relationship as if, Jonathan's at least 20 years older than David. And usually when we think of people in that kind of relationship, we think of a mentorship, where the younger is learning from the older. But we really didn't have that here, right? We didn't have like a mentorship. We had a mutual friendship.
Yeah.
As if they were both on the same plane, but at the same time, Jonathan exalting David above himself, even though he's way younger
Yeah.
than he is. You see the dynamic now is a little bit, I think, enhanced
Yeah.
when you think about that. That Jonathan would have been much older than David. Especially if David wasn't fighting there at the Valley of Elah because he wasn't yet 20. Says a lot. Anyway, something to think about.
Interesting.
You
As
know,
far as that
you said that he, in the song, he elevated Saul, you know. And now kind of when you say he was like a grandfather, I really think that David loved Saul, and he couldn't understand
yeah.
why in the
Absolutely.
world.
Yeah.
You know, why would he want to kill me?
Yeah.
I was with him, I took the
Yeah.
spirit
What
out
have I
of
done?
him. You know, come on.
Yeah.
There's no
Is that
evidence in
bad?
the text that David had any ill will
He
for
didn't.
Saul
Mm-mm.
at all, or he just was trying to understand
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
this
And he
man
loved him.
was
He really loved him.
after him. I do think
Yeah.
so. I do think so. Yes. I would encourage you. I have a whole list here. This is what I did with it. How do we make this apply? Right. That's the whole. We get through the text and we get the beautiful story, and all of these things are intriguing. But the heart of it is, well, what does this mean to me? What, you know, why is it important for me to know this? What do I need to glean from this that will help me? Or help somebody I love or something. How can this be helpful in our lives? And I think the real, one of the ways is to think about what true friendship really looks like.
Yeah.
You're seeing here genuine friendship. Genuine. And I would even add genuine in the Lord friendship. This isn't even worldly friendship. Which brings up a lot of things. I don't even know if I want to go into all that, but probably not. But anyway, I made a list of all of the things that I could think of that are the earmarks of true friendship. Obviously, love, right? That's the biggest one. You think of loyalty. You guys could think of 1,000 of them right now if you just said. But I would encourage you to do that. We don't have to go through my whole list, but I think you'll see. I don't even know, 15 things listed here probably. That's what you see here with Jonathan and David. Genuine friendship in the Lord. Which, you know, I've even known of brothers and sisters whose best friends, they said, they weren't even Christians. And I have often wondered, how does that work?
It's real hard.
When
I
you're
have
not
a
on
good
the
friend.
same
Yeah.
page
Yeah.
foundationally, at the core.
Mhm.
And that's what I think you learn here. Jonathan and David were friends at the very heart of what was most important in all of life.
Mhm.
At the very core of all things, they had the Lord in common. I think that says a lot. I think that, I mean, these are things that you want to teach, you know, your children, your grandchildren, your young people in Bible classes. That's the kind of stuff you want to ingrain in their thinking. That's what you want them to look for. You know, and that would be another lesson in itself. What kind of friends do you want? Or what kind of friends should you be?
Yeah.
This here gives a bunch, a huge list of attributes we can attain, you know, to strive for in order to be better friends, or in order to help us look for the right kind of friends. Anyway, so I think that's a good exercise to help make it applicable. And if we had more time, I would go through my list. But we don't have time. Okay, that's all. Homework is this. So the next section in our study is now going to be David in the wilderness. That is going to be beginning in chapter 21 all the way through the end of the book to chapter 31, and even beyond, but a little bit. But we're not going to take that giant chunk in one class. We're going to divide it up. And so for next week, if you will read 1 Samuel 21 through chapter 25, not just to chapter 25, but all the way through chapter 25. So chapters 21 through 25, that will be David in the Wilderness, part 1. And then the next week after that, the Lord willing, we'll take part 2. Okay?
Okey-dokey.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for
Everybody
being here
enjoy the
today.
weather. I know we have Connie. Are you up for leading a prayer this morning? Okay, good. Susan did it last week in your plan.
Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome. Anytime.
I tried to get out of that, but I couldn't.
I hope it was helpful.
Yes, it was cortisone. They went in,
Oh,
it was
yeah.
like a day surgery. They went in deep.
Yeah.
So,
I'm glad it was helpful.
it was.
Good. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for this beautiful day that you've given us. And thank you for all these ladies that we can come and learn more of your word and get deep into the word. And thank you for Veronica for all the work she does toward this. Please go with us through the day and on through our lives, that we'll always be a light to shine to all those around us. Keep us safe. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Connie. I'm going to say one more thing, because I'm going to see how this works with y'all. This is just a, what is it? What's the word? I can't think of words today.
Exercise.
Exercise, yeah, I don't know. Just an experiment. Let's try that. Okay, we have our homework to read, right? 21 through 25. But, I kind of dropped it with the whole what does true friendship look like kind of thing, and, and I made my own list or whatever. Let's, we have either our text thread or we have the YouTube channel where this is archived, where you can comment. You could go in there, and if you don't even have to watch the thing, just click on it so it'll start playing, and then you can make comments or whatever. I would love to hear what you come up with in your list about friendship. I would. Wouldn't that be a good thing to share with one another?
Yeah.
I think it would be. So I'm going to put that out there to see if anybody does that. I'm not going to go first because I think that would be cheating. But I would love to hear from you.
It's
That's
hard
all.
to have. I have a real good friend. We've known each other since 4th grade.
Yeah.
Her dad was the Church of God preacher. Mine
Oh,
was the Church
wow.
of Christ.
Oh, wow.
And my dad tried to study with her dad, and